Hello, and welcome to Arts of Hermes, a show about Hermeticism and the Hermetic arts of magic, alchemy, and astrology, in theory and in practice, from the modern day to the ancient world, a show interested in esoteric philosophy, occulture, surrealism, cosmic consciousness, and more. Welcome to the first episode of Arts of Hermes. My name is Matthew Vaughn. I'm a writer and practicing Hermeticist, and this is a new show I'm launching talking about Hermeticism, primarily aimed at practitioners of Hermetic or esoteric, Western esoteric traditions, but I hope it will be interesting to others as well. So in this show, I'd like to do a series of series focusing on different topics and different aspects of modern Hermeticism and the esoteric tradition, and also reaching back into its past and its history, but always rooted in a concern with contemporary practitioners and their practice and its relationship to the culture and society and other contemporary issues. So, as I said, I'd like to do a focus in different series on a variety of different topics that will be of interest and use. And so in this first series, I'd like to focus on what I'm calling here occulture. And we'll talk in just a few minutes about what I mean by that term and what some others have meant by that term as well. We'll be really focusing on arts and culture here rather than on the theory and practice of esotericism itself in this first series, partially just because this is an interest of mine that I've had for a long time that I've never really had a forum to be able to explore in depth, but also because in thinking about my own entrance into esoteric practice, as well as many others practitioners that I've talked to over the years, it's often the case that people practicing these things and interested in these things got the doorway into these practices was through contact with a band or a novel that touched on esoteric themes that sparked their interest, that helped to open up the possibility that other sorts of ways of being in the world and relating to consciousness and the cosmos were possible, and that there was a tradition there waiting to be explored. So I think I'd also like to do that for this reason too, to sort of follow out part of the kind of initiatory path that myself and so many others have taken. So if you like the work that I'm doing and you would like to support my work, you can look at the links below. I recently published the first part of two parts of my first book, Between the Worlds, a book attempting to articulate a modern Hermetic worldview and explore some of the implications and concepts around Hermeticism and what that could mean in the modern day. So you can purchase a copy of that book. There's a link below. I'm also in the process of setting up a Patreon account, and as soon as that is set up, I will put in the link below. All of the videos that I make in this series and in future series, none of them will be behind paywalls, and I'd like to make these available, to anyone who wants these things. Who I don't want them to be restricted. So I'm working, I guess, on what you would call a gift economy here. That all of these things are being offered, with no charge, no monetary block to accessing them. But I would ask you to consider if you value these things or you find them entertaining or useful, consider supporting my work. These take quite a bit of time and effort to produce, and if I can have some financial support, it will certainly increase my ability to continue doing this or even to produce more content. All right, so let's just get into our topic for today. So, as I said, this first series will be on the topic of occulture, that is, occult culture. This will be a 24-part series, so this video here that you're now watching, and then 23 videos to follow. We're going to do them about over the next 6 months, so approximately once per week. A new video will be coming out. And in this first video here, I'd just like to introduce the idea of a culture and begin to make some forays into the sort of zone of a culture and different aspects of it and what we might mean, as well as some of the themes and topics that we will come back to several times throughout the series. And then finally, in the end, give a little bit of overview of the different topics we'll be encountering and discussing throughout the series. So we can start off talking about the meaning of this word, what I mean by it, what some others have meant by it. Then we'll look at a few examples of a culture and talk about that. And then finally at the end, we will look at some of the broader sort of social and political and other sort of themes and implications that I'm going to want to return to and consider over the course of the series. All right, so to get us started off, we will sort of break a culture down into the two words that make it up, occult culture. And I just want to make a few comments about each of these words here and what we mean by them. So the word occult is from the Latin occultus, meaning hidden, concealed, or secret, and is the past participle of occulare, meaning to cover over or to conceal. So the occult is, that which is, in the broadest sense, is that which is hidden or secret, as occult knowledge, occult organizations. But typically, this is not meant to be, and state secrets and things like that aren't usually called occult, except when it's being used metaphorically. We can also use the word occult to talk about hidden or concealed aspects of reality. So we might talk about occult forces or occult entities, an occult dimension of reality itself. Historically, I've not really liked this word. I'd much prefer to talk about, esotericism or hermeticism rather than occultism, partially because of the just sort of negative connotations or social stigma around that word. It often gives people the wrong impression. But I've been trying to rehabilitate it a little bit in order to, because I really like the term occulture, and I like the the implication of the sort of hiddenness there as well, which of course you also have in esotericism. Anyways, so we don't typically use the word occult to just mean anything that is hidden or concealed for any reason, but typically something that is related to the supernatural, the magical, esotericism, particularly Western esotericism. The word isn't. We're not going to be focused on esoteric traditions from other cultures primarily, though of course it will come up. I mean, the West is certainly not an isolated thing, and what the word West even means is, of course, a rather fraught and difficult topic. Anyways, that's something we will, I'm sure we'll talk about as we come to different topics within our series here. All right, so occult can refer to the ritual magic, to alchemy, to astrology, and so on. Things like divination, aspects of traditional Western medicine, herbal aspects of traditional herbalism, and things like that can all kind of fall under the heading of the occult and the esoteric. All right, and then finally, I think it's helpful to be aware of a concept of coming out of the academic world, particularly from the scholar Wouter Hanegraaff, who talks about Western esotericism as rejected knowledge, the idea that the only thing that really makes a Western esoteric tradition or a secret tradition within the West is the fact that it's just kind of all the stuff that's rejected in the process from the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and the Enlightenment, the process that essentially produces like Western modernity, and that all the stuff that gets rejected in that process is simply kind of lumped together and then retroactively understood as a secret tradition. I think that there's a lot more to it than just that. That is ignoring some actual traditions that really do run in the underground throughout the West. Often these are pagan or polytheistic strands rather than simply being occult or esoteric knowledge. And I think pagan polytheism is in a sense the original kind of Western counterculture. It's certainly something that's never really gone away and has survived in all sorts of concealed forms, often concealed even from the people transmitting these images and ideas. But that's something we can talk about maybe later in the series or in a future series. But I also think, speaking as a hermeticist, I enjoy or appreciate the sort of retroactivity of it, that a tradition can sort of retroactively emerge, that just because it's something that only really comes into consciousness or awareness through its rejection in the modern world doesn't mean that it can't be still a vital current, that if we embrace sort of the strange temporalities, retro causality, and other sort of concepts like that we encounter in esoteric practice, I think it doesn't have to mean that that these things are just a kind of grab bag of all the things that are pushed out of the culture, that there is a real living vital force there within the tradition. All right, and then the word culture, can refer, of course, it can have a number of different senses. We can talk about the collective customs and achievements of a people, a particular form of collective intellectual development, also language, thought, customs, beliefs, arts, cosmology, metaphysics, values, etc., considered as a unit. It's also worth just noting that cultures also include subcultures, and that dominant cultures generate countercultures. So a culture is never a simple, non-contradictory, monolithic entity, but always has aspects and pieces, some of which are not necessarily harmonious or even really compatible with each other. And we'll talk more about the concept of contradiction, but I think that will be a helpful way of thinking about a culture, is that it is always related to some of the contradictions and complications within a culture. All right, so let's just take a look at this word, a culture, and where it comes from, and what some other writers and thinkers have said about it in the past. So as far as I'm aware, the first appearance of this word in English is in William Irwin Thompson's book, Evil and World Order, from 1976. This is a book, he's concerned with the evolution of human consciousness, and is a bit of a little bit related to someone like James Lovelock, or the kind of Gaia hypothesis. He has some of those same sort of concerns, and he's interested in the development of a kind of planetary, like global culture, and an emerging like planetary consciousness. Like a lot of different writers and thinkers in the 1970s, he really saw his moment as a major point of crisis. And so he really, in a kind of apolitical way that I'm not really a big fan of, he looked towards the development and the evolution of human consciousness as a way out of this crisis that he saw. So anyways, in this book, he doesn't really use the term a culture. He only uses it as the title of a particular chapter within the book. He doesn't actually employ it in the text, but in this chapter he does touch on a number of the themes that we will touch on. Let's see, I have one quotation here that I pulled out of this chapter. So he talks about Carlos Castaneda here and a few other figures. Let's see, the kind of main figures of a culture for him include people like John C. Lilly, the dolphin researcher and psychedelic explorer. Let's see, people like Ram Dass, Carlos Castaneda, and also a pair of French writers that we will talk about considerably and devote a whole episode to, named Pauwels and Berger, and their book, The Morning of the Magicians, which was published in French in 1960, and then the English translation in 1963, and that had a huge impact on the emergence of the particular form of a culture associated with the 1960s and 70s and the counterculture of that time. So he's interested in a number of these figures, especially figures who bridge between sort of modern science and academia, and this more occult or esoteric perspective here. So anyways, in this quote he says, although Carlos Castaneda was not able to integrate the separate reality of Don Juan with the reality of UCLA. So I assume a lot of people watching this have some familiarity with who Carlos Castaneda was. He wrote a series of books that purported to document his initiation and tutelage under a Yaqui shaman named Don Juan, who initiates him into various shamanic practices and mysteries. Though it was later revealed that Don Juan was not actually a real person. And that Castaneda had invented the scenario. Although many people, Castaneda was never someone that was particularly important to me, but I know a number of people for whom these books were really important and who continue to find value in Castaneda's work, despite knowing that they're not literal accounts of a true tradition or true experiences. And that's something else I think that we can maybe come back to as we think about a culture, the strange, weird relationship between fiction and nonfiction, between truth, imagination, and reality, and all that. I think Castaneda is kind of an interesting figure in that conversation. So anyways, he says that Castaneda was not able to integrate the separate reality of Don Juan with the reality of UCLA. Most of the other explorers in the occult are convinced of the cultural necessity of just such an integration. If one looks at the occult from an historical point of view, he can see that there is a relation between periods of imaginative growth in science and periods of intense interest in the occult. Paracelsus and Copernicus in the 16th century and Dr. John Dee and Francis Bacon in the 17th century are the two sides of the coin of the scientific imagination. So yeah, again, he's interested in this relationship between kind of the occult and the scientific. His examples are also rather interesting, possibly more interesting than he realizes. Obviously, for the 16th century there, he's using Paracelsus and Copernicus. Paracelsus is obviously the occultist there. But Copernicus was not simply a scientist in our understanding of the work. I mean, Copernicus himself practiced astrology, and the concern with astrological tables was part of his motivation for rethinking planetary motion. He also cites the authority of Hermes Trismegistus and things like that in some of his writings. And similarly, like Francis Bacon, although he is an extremely important figure in the development of modern science, he himself was also very influenced by Hermetic thought and magical thought. So yeah, we can talk about Bacon in a future series, perhaps. Anyways, let's just keep moving here. All right, so another quote here from probably the contemporary scholar who is maybe most associated with the term occulture, a man named Christopher Partridge. Let's see, so this is an essay that he wrote about, so it was within an anthology about paganism and popular music, about Genesis P. Orridge. I'm sure a lot of you watching this already know who Genesis P. Orridge is. I'm going to say she, I'm not 100% clear on what Genesis's final pronoun preferences were. But anyway, she was began and is probably still most famous as the singer and front person for the industrial music group Thrupp and Gristle that formed in England in the 1970s. Later went on to start the band Psychic Television or Psychic TV, and also to found and lead an esoteric order called Temple of Psychic Youth. And we'll talk more about Temple of Psychic Youth and Genesis P. Orridge in the next series, the next video in this series that'll be out next week. All right, so let's see. So in Partridge's quote here, he says, "I was aware that it," meaning the word occulture, I was aware that the word occulture had begun to gain some currency within the occult community in the late 1980s. I was also aware of a small festival simply entitled Occulture that had been established in Brighton, England in 2000 in order, so Justin Hankinson, one of the organizers, told me, to protect the rights and interests of people working in the esoteric domain. When I asked Hankinson about the origin of the term, he suggested that it was most likely to have been coined by Genesis P. Orridge, Neil Andrew Megson, the founder of the experimental ritual magic network, the Temple of Psychic Youth. All right, and then let's see. So sticking for a moment here within the world of industrial culture, this is the kind of editorial by Simon Dwyer, the editor of a journal called Rapid Eye, that was part of. It covered sort of industrial music and related figures like William Burroughs and Brian Geisen, who are all figures that we'll talk about in this series. And he employs the term occulture, and in this editorial here, he talks about how he came to the term, and he also has some interesting suggestions about the meaning and significance of the term here. So I just wanted to read the whole editorial here. He starts out with three rather interesting quotes here, three epigraphs. So let's see, he quotes Ferdinand de Cheval, who I'm not sure who that is, but anyway, interesting quote here. He says, "From dreams to reality is a long way." Then another quote from Roger Cardinal, who says, "Throughout history, there have always been forms of art alien to established culture and which, ipso facto, have been neglected and finally lost without trace." And then third here, we have a quote from Michel Foucault, who says, "You have to paint things black if you want to make future possibilities more vivid." So already I think we have a number of themes that we will talk about and explore today and in the coming videos. The connection, often very weird connection between dream and reality, and imagination and reality. The second quote here talking about art that is alien to established culture. So again, tapping into ideas of sort of counterculture and subversion, as well as culture that is neglected or rejected in some way. And then I think the third quote here especially relates to to industrial culture, the idea of painting things black, the sometimes extremely dark and pessimistic worldview put forward in a lot of their music and writings associated with that culture. Though, seeing in it the possibility of something more vibrant and vivid being born out of that, which is another theme that we will definitely talk about in the following video and probably some others. All right, let's see. So Dwyer says, "I have been wondering for some weeks what to say to introduce Rapid Eye. It was, after all, so obvious. Then, as fate would have it, a few hours before deadline, I was given an angle, or rather, I was given a word. My good and clever friend David Brooks rang me up and gave it to me, his voice crackling with excitement down the line of cyberspace. Actually, he mentioned a word that he had just invented as the title of an alternative bookshop he was planning to open, and I stole it. I believe that this process of plagiarism is called the acid burn in contemporary parlance, a very postmodernist thing to do. The word he gave me was occulture. This new word suggests both culture and the occult. To me, this occulture is not a secret culture, as the word might suggest, but a culture that is in some way hidden and ignored, or willfully marginalized to the extremities of our society. A culture of individuality and subcults, a culture of questions that have not been properly identified, let alone answered, and therefore do not get a fair representation in the mainstream media. It is a culture that has been misinterpreted, not because it is evil or wrong, but because it is generally apolitical and amoral, unashamedly artistic, experimental, undogmatic, intellectual, and oddly evolutionary. It is a subculture that is forming a question that reality alone cannot answer, which is why it makes people nervous. This, it seems, is why Rapid Eye has always been about. The word now belongs to everyone. All these words or worlds are yours." That last sentence there is a Arthur C. Clarke sort of citation from 2010, the sequel to 2001. The phrase "all these worlds are yours" appears a number of times in that book, but he's sort of changing it to "all these words are yours." We give you a culture. All right, so let's just keep moving on here. All right, so in this quote here, we got Christopher Partridge again. This is from the first volume in a rather long monograph that he's done on occulture called The Reenchantment of the West, which has some interesting passages in it. I haven't found it extremely useful, but he does make some interesting comments broad comments about occulture. Let's see. So he says, although because the most conspicuous streams of religion are drying up, it may look as though the West is experiencing creeping secularization. This, in fact, is not the whole story. What we are witnessing in the West is a confluence of secularization and sacralization. Spiritualities are emerging that are not only quite different from the dying forms of the religion, but are often defined over against them and are articulated in ways that do not carry the baggage of traditional religion. Unlike those forms of religion which are in serious decline, the new spiritual awakening makes use of thought forms, ideas, and practices which are not at all alien to the majority of Westerners. They emerge from an essentially non-Christian religio-cultural milieu, a milieu that both resources and is resourced by popular culture. The occult milieu, what I refer to as occulture. So a bunch of interesting themes here, and all things that we will definitely want to come back to and talk about as we go along. Let's see, I think in particular this idea of the confluence of secularization and sacralization that I think, especially over the last, 25 years or something, there's been the perception that that there is our culture is in some way defined by the conflict between like a traditional religious mindset and a kind of atheist, materialist, scientific worldview. Whereas I think a culture, as he's sort of indicating here, is interestingly participates in both without really being compatible with either. Again, I think this theme that we'll come back to of contradiction here, that I think a culture operates a very interesting place within that contradiction between, in his terms here, secularization and sacralization, without choosing one side or the other, but being sort of both and neither in I think a complex and also really powerful way. Let's see, what else did I want to say here? Yeah, I think also his sense that these traditions have a kind of relationship or influence with popular culture that sort of moves back and forth, that they both influence and are influenced by popular culture. And that, again, I think is something that we will see, the way that popular culture draws on esoteric ideas, and then esoteric practitioners draw on like popular cultural forms, and that sort of trading back and forth is I think one of the main ways that a culture progresses. Also, nice academic speak there, use of resource as a verb, which is pretty good. All right, let's move on. So here's a quote from an introduction to, we saw the word, let's see, what did he say at the sort of occult milieu, and he's referencing or drawing on the concept of the cultic milieu that had already been in circulation in some academic circles, exploring some of these topics around what we're calling a culture here. So let's see, the authors here say, when the British sociologist Colin Campbell first published his theory of the cultic milieu, which is reprinted entirely in this volume, the phenomenon he described so well was hardly new. That there exists within every society a small but dedicated underground of true seekers of esoteric and, very often, forbidden knowledge is well known. The Middle Ages had its heretics, magicians, and alchemists, whose quests were not unlike those of the seekers described so well by Campbell as inhabiting the cultic milieu. And then a few pages later, they say, the cultic milieu is oppositional by nature. The cultic milieu is a zone in which prescribed and or forbidden knowledge is the coin of the realm, a place in which ideas, theories, and speculations are to be found, exchanged, and modified, and eventually adopted or rejected. So again, touching on some of the same themes that we've already talked about here. I think in particularly thinking about a culture, or what they're calling the cultic milieu here, as a zone or a sort of cultural space, rather than any kind of coherent traditional worldview, is really interesting. A culture tends to be extremely eclectic and fluid, and it's difficult to make any kind of generalizations about what those involved in a culture necessarily believe. And that's certainly other themes that we can definitely come back to. Even the relationship between like belief and skepticism, and the sort of complex positions that a cultural productions and those producing it often take in relationship to those forces. All right, let's see. Back to Christopher Partridge again. Another quote from The Reenchantment of the West. Let's see, so he says, Westerner culture includes a range of deviant ideas and practices, although it is debatable as to whether some of these beliefs are socially deviant or indeed hidden, bearing in mind their massive and rising popularity. Again, I think pointing to some of this kind of contradictory position of a culture, that it is at once apparently hidden or secret or esoteric, and yet it appears in television and in mainstream films and comic books and other sort of things. So yeah, I think that's another thing that we can kind of interrogate as we go through this series, about to what extent these things are hidden, concealed, or esoteric, and to what extent they are simply part of mainstream culture. All right, let's see. So these deviant ideas and practices, including magic, as devised by Aleister Crowley, extreme right-wing religiopolitics, radical environmentalism and deep ecology, angels, spirit guides and channeled messages, astral projection, crystals, dream therapy, human potential spiritualities, the spiritual significance of ancient and mythical civilizations, astrology, healing, earth mysteries, tarot, numerology, Kabbalah, feng shui, prophecies, e.g. Nostradamus, Arthurian legend, the Holy Grail, Druidry, Wicca, heathenism, palmistry, shamanism, goddess spirituality, Gaia spirituality and eco-spirituality, alternative science, esoteric Christianity, UFOs, alien abduction, and so on. So quite a good list there, and quite an impressive number of endnotes. Was it like 30 endnotes in one sentence? Let's see. So hopefully it's obvious that all of these things are, again, part of a zone or part of a field. A lot of these items that he's listed out here are not really compatible with each other. And, I think people within this zone, need to sort of navigate their relationship to these different things. And obviously some of them are even a bit alarming or concerning, like extreme right-wing religiopolitics that he mentions there, which is something we'll come back to towards the end of this episode. But yeah, obviously just highlighting the great diversity and range of the things within this zone, which we could maybe even think of as a kind of ecology that influences and ideas sort of trade back and forth between these different sort of sub traditions or sort of sub schools of thought or little congealed sort of movements within the broader range of a culture that, again, influence each other, sort of break apart, develop new forms, mutate, and often come into conflict with each other as well. All right, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense of, the significance of the term and what some other scholars and thinkers, both from the underground, from the, from the industrial culture, like people like Genesis P. Orridge and Simon Dwyer that we saw, as well as academics there like Christopher Partridge. So, especially as we saw in that last quote there from Partridge, obviously that broad use of the term occulture really covers, everything that we will ever talk about in this show, even in future series. Any talk about magic, alchemy, astrology, etc., that's always within the domain of culture. So for the purposes of this particular series, I'm going to use occulture in a somewhat limited sense, though of course always with the broader sense in mind. So our particular focus in the course of this series on occulture will be on the arts and in their reflection and dynamic relationship with a culture in the broader sense, and with the larger culture of which it is a part. So yeah, as I was just saying, without losing that broader implication, we're going to sort of focus in on the arts and how they reflect and interact with those broader contexts. So let's see, I'd like to understand culture as something that emerges within modernity, sometimes in harmony with it, sometimes not. So, we can talk about a culture, stretching, way back into the pre-modern period or even into antiquity, but I want to really restrict our scope here to not just the modern world, but I've limited, just for the sake of not having this go on and on for years, to more or less the last 100, maybe 120 years or so. And even within that, this series will be incredibly partial. There's no way, I don't know if it's even possible to do a really complete survey of a culture and the appearance of these themes within the arts. So we will be making our way through, often guided by my own intuition, my own sense of where there are, productions that contain some sort of, magical power or significance that is really worth spending some time with. Though we'll mention other things as well in passing. All right, so I also want to emphasize, and this is something, again, we'll talk about as we go on, that occulture, I think, really sits outside of a lot of the normal kind of hierarchical structure that we think of in terms of culture, like, for example, oppositions between mass culture and counterculture, as we've already talked about, the opposition between high culture and low culture, or between pop culture and the avant-garde, or between the ivory tower and the underground, as we've already started started to see ideas coming out of industrial culture sort of passing into to academia, or conversely, people from countercultures drawing on academic resources, and the way that a culture can sort of move in and through these different domains and draw on them or appropriate pieces of them, change their context, and sort of mutate and transform them for its own purposes. All right, and then finally, just in the sense that I would like to use the word occulture here as modern culture, and again, specifically sort of the arts that participate in an enchanted world without being conventionally religious. So, again, trying to occupy that sort of third sort of weird zone, between the enchanted and the disenchanted, the modern and the traditional, and the sort of the religious and the sort of scientific or atheistic. All right, so let's move into the sort of second middle phase of this video, and we'll look at some examples of occulture. So again, as I just said, we'll really be focused on the last 100 or 120 years or so, but I just wanted to include an example of older forms of a culture, or the esoteric, within culture, that of course, inform everything that happens in the modern contemporary world, but also the way that sometimes these themes within esoteric or within Western culture can be like forgotten or lost, although still persisting, sometimes below the level of general conscious awareness. So here's the Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, painting I'm sure you've all seen many times. I mean, even to the point of it becoming a kind of like cliche work that's difficult to appreciate as an actual work of art, because it's becomes so sort of banal and trivial by its representation or its whatever appearance on tea towels or whatever. But there is some real possibility that this painting was actually created as a magical, a kind of magical talisman, something imbued with esoteric significance and intention. Botticelli was good friends with Marsilio Ficino, the important Renaissance Hermeticist or Platonist. Who was also a practicing astrologer and astrological magician, and developed ideas about traditional talismans, which always contain an image. That's something that's sometimes lost in more modern uses of the word talisman, but traditionally talismans always had images, and so Ficino really develops ideas around image magic and begins to connect kind of medieval talismanic practices with art and the production of art. And so there is the suggestion that Botticelli's Birth of Venus is actually a kind of talisman of the planet Venus, and that her energies or kind of spirits, intelligences associated with her are were being attempted to be drawn into this picture and to have a positive beneficial effect as the planet Venus is on the viewer of the painting. All right, let's move on to our next example here. All right, so now coming into the 20th century here, we have a really wonderful painter, Hilma af Klint, who is I think esoteric or occult in a number of, or at least two possible senses here. Not only was she a dedicated theosophist and spiritual practitioner who really approached her works as a sort of spiritual practice, imbuing them with all kinds of spiritual significance and power, but they're also occult in the sense that she kept them hidden and didn't really reveal them to the public, and even for decades after her death, they were not to be shown to the public. Now their kind of esoteric content certainly had partially to do with that. I think also her place as a woman in the development of abstract art, and she really has a claim to be the first abstract painter. Where exactly abstraction emerges is, a kind of continuing subject of debate in art history, but she's certainly right there at the beginning. But obviously the women artists were very often marginalized and not taken seriously, and so that combined with the explicitly spiritual and esoteric content obviously made them pretty unacceptable, to a lot of the dominant culture and the art world of that time. And that's something we can continue to talk about, the way in which a lot of modern art, so much modern art and literature and music has esoteric and occult sort of themes in them, even though often the dominant culture and the kind of critical and academic reception of these things is often very uncomfortable with that fact, and really undermines some of the dominant narratives around like the development and significance of modern art. And that's something we will definitely talk about in future videos. All right, so another 20th century painter here. We have the wonderful painter Remedios Varo, who is often considered a surrealist. Varo herself, especially in the last sort of 8 or 9 years of her life, the most vibrant period, wasn't really identifying as a surrealist any longer, even though she had still maintained relationships with a number of them and obviously kind of came out of the surrealist milieu. Anyways, this is a great painting of hers called The Juggler or The Magician, referencing the tarot here, of course. The magician of the tarot was in older decks called the Juggler. The transformation of the Juggler into the magician was part of this sort of esoteric interpretation of the tarot that took place in the kind of late 18th and early 19th centuries. So we see the Juggler figure there, robed in sort of scarlet, with a pentagram head there. We see at his feet alchemical emblems and emblems of the 4 elements, as well as some other like mythological and symbolic animals. There's a bird and a lion and some other things in these paintings. Varo's a really wonderful painter, one of my favorites. I had originally wanted to do a whole video about Varo, but I'm going to save her for a future video series, as well as a few other figures, all kind of surrealist or surrealist adjacent figures that I think would be better to talk about, who have some connections to the writings of like P.D. Uspensky and some interesting early 20th century ideas about the 4th dimension, or 4th spatial dimension. But there's a lot there and a lot to unpack, and I still have some more reading and research to do about that. So we'll save her for a future series. We will also save the works of the filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky, in particular his film Holy Mountain, which is really a missing piece in this series. Holy Mountain is a kind of major touchstone for like esoteric art and culture, in the recent times. But again, I'd like to save that to put it in its proper context in a future video. Just a couple more words about Varo, maybe. Her practice of art not only contains, esoteric references and esoteric images, but her making of her paintings was very often ritualized. She had these sort of charged crystals that she would actually use to scratch away paint on the surface. What's it called? Sgraffito? Is that the right word? But the sort of painting like technique, but she would specifically use like charged ritual implements. In this painting here and some of her others, she inlaid like mother of pearl into the canvas. So using ritualized techniques and esoterically significant materials, and really ritualizing and making magical the entire process of the creation, in addition to depicting magical and esoteric themes within the paintings, which again is something I think we'll talk about, the way that there's a difference between a work that contains esoteric or occult or magical themes or images, and then works whose process is ritualized or is understood as magical, or the effects are understood as magical. And of course, you often get more than one of those things, but I think it's a nice an important distinction to make. All right, let's keep moving on here. All right, so switching from high culture to low culture, I want to look at a few different examples, all from comic books, about different ways that esoteric sort of themes or ideas appear in the very different registers, I guess we could say, of the occult within, just focused on the particular medium of comic books here. All right, so first here we have the appearance of occult or esoteric themes, really as entertainment, as sort of color used here, but there's no reason to think there's any real, esoteric kind of intention here, and viewers of it tend to perceive it, simply as entertainment, without a lot of greater significance, though of course they reflect the culture of their times. The X-Men was, I believe the comic was created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee in, I think it was 1963. And so, even we see the whatever you call it, the strap line there, the top, the strangest teens of all time. This is from a slightly later issue from 1971. But obviously reflecting things happening in the counterculture and youth culture of its time, and the whole idea with the X-Men, these sort of mutants who are a higher evolution of humanity, endowed with all kinds of special powers that the broader culture can't understand or accept, definitely taps into a lot of genuinely cultural ideas. In particular, some of the themes in The Morning of the Magicians, a book that we'll be talking about. And then on the right, we have an example from the comic Hellboy. This is from, I believe, the first story. I don't know Hellboy super well. Don't know X-Men super well either, to be honest. This was the story that was turned into the first film there. And so we've got a whole bunch of a cultural, sort of, especially like pulp kind of a cultural themes, all rolled into this one image here. So they are in an ancient stone circle on I think it's a fictional island off of the coast of Scotland, I believe. And in the center there we see Rasputin, who is now working for the Nazis. And the whole topic of Nazi occultism is something that, unfortunately, we will have to touch on a few times. We can save that discussion for later. Actually, that's something else that also really comes out of the Morning of the Magicians, that really popularized that idea that there was some sort of esoteric or occult significance to Nazism. We'll save that discussion for later. So this is Rasputin working for the Nazis, and not just conducting magical ritual, but also using, see these kind of like Tesla coils. He's got these special electrified gloves on him there. Ancient mysteries, modern technology, all sorts of, Rasputin, Nazi occultism, all kind of rolled into one there. All right, so moving from just from this kind of pulp sort of entertainment use of occult to the opposite extreme, here are two examples of comics that we'll both be talking about. I'll devote a whole series to each one of these two comics. Alan Moore's Promethea and Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, two comic book series that not only deal at great length with esoteric themes, but in both cases that were explicitly conceived of as magical workings, that the creation and production of them were understood as a ritual. There was an attempt to alter presumably the consciousness of the creator in the process, but also in the reader of the text. So these are absolutely magical works created with very definite magical intention, as well as dealing with magical themes, and we will talk about both of them at length. They also, I chose these two covers here, these particular covers, because they also show the influence of psychedelic and 1960s and 70s counterculture, which is something we'll be talking about repeatedly throughout the series here, on esoteric practitioners. Again, talking about the that sort of play back and forth between like esoteric culture and pop culture, the one influencing the other, and then passing that influence back again. All right, and then our last comic book example here will be something of a slightly intermediate example. This is Doctor Strange. Here we have two strips from the mid-60s. I believe Doctor Strange actually started in the same year that X-Men did, 1963. Again, not unlike X-Men, picking up on counterculture of the time, certainly psychedelic culture. Some of the early writers and creators, like I believe Steve Ditko, who's the artist in these two examples that we see here, and some others have spoken about their use of psychedelics and the influence that had on their comic creations. And not only is Doctor Strange, an esoteric, a magician, an esoteric practitioner, but this theme of his entering these increasingly strange other worlds and universes obviously taps into the psychedelic counterculture. And that counterculture really recognized that in Doctor Strange, and it had a big influence on the development of that counterculture. I believe it was Jefferson Airplane that headlined a concert in, was it 1965, if I'm remembering correctly, celebrating Doctor Strange. And I've heard a number of stories of people using like panels or images from Doctor Strange to either like program psychedelic experiences, or even using them as something almost like a kind of portal for a kind of scrying experience, so that, and this is something that we'll talk about with some other examples of a culture, the way that the things can be made more accultural by their reception, that the viewers and fans of a thing can often imbue things with a kind of significance that its creators didn't necessarily intend. Although X-Men and Doctor Strange have kind of a similar sort of relationship to the counterculture of their time, Doctor Strange is really imbued by a number of its fans with a special type of significance, which I think is an interesting thing, the way that the reception of things can really alter them. In the two panels that we see on the left there, we see Doctor Strange not only doing an invocation there, but then also they're calling it entering an ethereal trance, and sort of leaving his body to be able to enter another domain, which is a practice that esotericists actually practice. Right, this isn't just total. I mean, there's plenty of exaggerated sort of fantasy magic throughout the series, but there's also elements of real esoteric practices that appear. And then in the right, this is one of these examples of these incredibly strange psychedelic worlds that he enters, and we see in the box at the top, our mystical saga begins in a dimension so alien, so incredible, so utterly beyond human comprehension, there are no words in any earthly language to describe it. So, quite psychedelic here. All right, and then I think interesting example of the way that things get sort of picked up and transformed here in this the Pink Floyd album cover here. This is from the 1968 album, Saucerful of Secrets. We actually have images taken from a Doctor Strange comic. It's not super easy to see, but on the right-hand side of the cover, there is an image of Doctor Strange himself, and actually up in the top left, kind of right underneath the D there, sort of between the D and the Y there on the top left, there's a face of an entity that Doctor Strange was encountering in that same panel there. So they're obviously taking Doctor Strange and using it as part of this very obviously psychedelic kind of cosmic image that they've created here for this album cover. So again, like linking this sort of low culture comic books to, to sort of acid rock and counterculture and really kind of, Pink Floyd later go a bit more pop, but they're really fairly committed to a kind of avant-garde sort of, musical practice at this time. Also, in the middle of the album cover here, there's a piece taken from a 17th century alchemical engraving that I've reproduced there on the right-hand side. So, combining Doctor Strange with sort of psychedelic and cosmic imagery, but also, at least intuitively connecting this back to the alchemical and the esoteric tradition, which I think is quite an interesting artifact, for example. All right, and then sort of staying with the realm of sort of pop music connected to sort of counterculture and the youth movement at that time. Here is a couple examples from David Bowie's music. Let's see. So in the little excerpt from the lyrics at the top, we have a couple lines from the song Quicksand from the album Hunky Dory, which is my favorite Bowie album. Let's see. So in the song he says, "I'm closer to the golden dawn, immersed in Crowley's uniform of imagery." Obviously referencing the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, arguably the most important order in the modern the sort of the esoteric revival of the 19th century, and really influencing all aspects of esoteric culture, up to the modern day. And then in the second line there, obviously referencing Aleister Crowley there. Let's see, in the image that we see on the right, which I believe this photograph was taken from around the same time that the album Station to Station came out. You can tell by his hair. Let's see, he is drawing a couple of images there. There's one behind him and one on the floor of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. These 10 sort of Sephiroth or levels of divine reality, and the sort of pathways between them that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and we will definitely be able to talk about the Tree of Life in a future video series at length. Extremely important image in modern esotericism. So anyways, yeah, he's drawing the Tree of Life there, and we see a couple of references to the Tree of Life in the excerpt from the lyrics of the song Station to Station. Let's see, some sort of magical things too. One magical moment, a reference to dreams, even like Lost in My Circle, we might think about magic circles. And then in the final two lines that I've quoted here, we get, here are we, one magical movement from Kether to Malkuth. So Kether is the name of the highest sphere, the highest Sephiroth on the Tree of Life, and then Malkuth is at the bottom. So this journey from the most abstract realms, which are associated with no color. That flashing no color line that we see there in the middle is probably a reference to the color correspondences of Kether. But yeah, this a journey from the highest down to the lowest here that's being referenced here. I don't know that Bowie was ever really a dedicated student or practitioner. There's a story about him believing that a demon lived in his pool at one point, though I know that was also during a period where he had become extremely paranoid related to heavy use of cocaine. So, make of that story what you will, I suppose. Oops. Okay, here we go. So another example from popular music, a little bit later here, from Kate Bush. This is for her song, and the video for the song Lily from her 1993 album Red Shoes, which both in the video and in the lyrics to the song reference the lesser ritual of the pentagram, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, probably the most... one of the biggest, most influential rituals that was created by the Golden Dawn, and has become, really ubiquitous, both in its original form as well as all sorts of variations that have been created by different authors and creators over time. So in the video, which the video also features, what's her name, Lily Cornford, who is a sort of spiritual teacher and healer that Bush was familiar, or that Bush had met and was familiar with. And we also get a bunch of very obviously magical images of someone drawing a circle in fire, and then even the appearance of these archangels here that are invoked in this verse, which is kind of a modified version of part of the lesser ritual of the pentagram, the invocations of the four archangels, Gabriel, Raphael, Michael, and Uriel, into the four quarters associated with the pentagram, and we see the angels appearing in the video. So let's just keep moving on here. All right, so one thing that we're not going to spend really much of any time at all talking about, but is maybe important at least to mention, is the presence of Satanism within a culture and modern culture. Satanism as we know it now, there's some earlier precedents for it, especially in the 19th century, but Satanism, I think as we think of it today, is really something that's created in the 1960s and 70s, and there's an interesting story about Satanism's relationship to the counterculture, but I am really just not interested in Satanism, so it's not going to be something that we're going to focus on here, but it's worth being aware of. And kind of like what we saw with the sort of comic books, you get the same sort of range of Satanism being used as simply a kind of theme for entertainment, like in the film The Devil Rides Out, which is in from, 1968, which is an adaptation of a novel by Dennis Wheatley from the 1930s, but very kind of pulp, sort of sensational sort of depiction of Satanism and satanic worship. Although, like in the film, at least, I haven't read the novel. But in the film, at least, there's actually bits and pieces of like magical circles that are really taken from like medieval or Renaissance era grimoires. So there's elements, of real occult things being used there, but obviously subordinated to a kind of, sensational sort of pulp kind of entertainment. And then since Satanism, although in its, kind of original forms or the form that really emerged in the 1960s, like the Church of Satan, led by Anton LaVey, was not theistic and did not actually believe in the reality of magic. They were essentially atheist materialists who liked, Satan as a kind of what they thought of, anyways, as a sort of subversive image. Although LaVey himself is, I think, really not as subversive as he himself might imagine himself to be, in his kind of extreme individuality, and really like embrace of essentially a kind of like right libertarian sort of worldview. He's really quite in line with, the imagery itself might be shocking in some of his ideas, but especially by the time we get to the 1980s, that sort of, kind of individualism is really a part of the core of like neoliberal sort of ideology. And that's something I've seen throughout all the kind of Satanism that I've encountered, is that that in its both in its individualism, as well as in its the fact that it's basically defined as an oppositional tradition, that it's defined by the thing it opposes. It always ends up being basically right wing in its fundamental political orientation, even if all of its practitioners don't necessarily always think of it that way. Let's just keep moving on here. All right, so let's switch to the, I guess sort of sticking with films. We saw The Devil Rides Out here. Here's an earlier film, really great German expressionist silent film from 1922, the film Nosferatu, which was a kind of unauthorized adaptation of the novel Dracula. Let's see, the producers of this film, in particular, the producer Albin Grau, who with Diekman there founded the production company Prana Films. Grau was a dedicated, sincere esoteric practitioner, connected to the occult scene. He hung out with Aleister Crowley when Crowley was in Berlin, and Grau wanted to produce a series of films that would, contain, genuine esoteric and occult themes, and help to sort of transmit these themes into the culture. And unfortunately, he was really terrible with money and finance, and the production of Nosferatu, and especially and the legal ramifications of this fact that they essentially it's an adaptation of Dracula with just the names of the characters changed, really bankrupted and ruined the studio, and they were never able to produce any further films. But a film created with the genuine intention to transmit esoteric and occult themes into the culture. I'd originally thought about doing a whole video dedicated to this film, but I think instead we will do the 1920 German expressionist film Der Golem, which also has some really extensive esoteric and occult themes and images in it. And we can use it also as a way of talking about the Golem legend and some of the other sort of films and novels and aspects of culture that the Golem legend, which comes out of Jewish esoteric tradition. So we can talk about all that in the future. All right, another film here. This is from the really wonderful but often not very well known 1973 film by Bill Gunn called Ganja and Hess. Like Nosferatu, it is a vampire film, but a very different sort of vampire film. Here, the vampires are being used to interrogate or sort of explore different aspects around like Black identity, particularly in the African American identity in the early 1970s, and I think there's some themes here in this movie that we'll definitely encounter in different forms. There's a really interesting way that it thematizes the sort of conflict between the sort of Christianity of the sort of Black present with the sort of pagan like African past. And it draws in a number of other, I think, really like complex themes around addiction, relationship, even the relationship between like race and social class, and a lot of other things in a really like complex and beautiful way. So yeah, it's a really great film. Definitely worth watching if you have not seen it. All right, and then final example of a film, and this is one we will talk about a little bit in a later series, and when we talk about folk horror, but maybe not unlike what we said about Doctor Strange, a film that, although it contains some occultural themes within it and taps into the kind of counterculture of its time, The Wicker Man has also been given a kind of esoteric significance by its fan base. A lot of people involved in like neo-paganism and Wicca that I've known have often, expressed, great admiration for this film, and watching it together has become an important part of that, at least aspects of that culture, which, is another thing we can think about too, the way that those sort of esoteric movements, they also develop their own cultures, and that's another sort of dimension of a culture, is the cultures that develop within esoteric movements or schools or societies or organizations. And again, sometimes cultural artifacts are picked up and recontextualized by those movements and given a significance that their creators may not necessarily have intended or been aware of. And yeah, we'll talk about The Wicker Man again in I think much later in this series. All right, so let's move into the sort of third and kind of final main section of this video here, and just talk about some of the sort of broader themes that we'll be exploring throughout this series. So something that we'll definitely be exploring is the imagination and the sort of significance of the human imagination and its power and its nature. Let's see, so I just have a few kind of comments that I wanted to make here. And again, these are all things that we will sort of come back to. I think that, in our contemporary, well, basically in the entire modern world, the idea of the imagination is really, really devalued and is often sort of synonymous with unreal, saying that something is just your imagination, or it's just imaginary, as a way of saying it's not real, or it's not important. We might value, creative solutions, or we might value imagination, in artists or cultural producers. But in general, it's seen as a fairly unimportant, aspect of human consciousness or the human mind, and is often associated with sort of children or with things that are kind of a waste of time or unserious. But this is very, very different from the way that imagination was understood in pre-modern times, where it was an extremely important, sometimes even close to the highest faculty of the human mind. As I just wanted to highlight a few other things here. So I think it's important that imagination is always involved in sort of relationships with other people, and in compassion as well, that imagination is necessary for being able to step outside of ourselves and to sort of imaginatively like project ourselves into the place of another. So yeah, just a way of highlighting the importance of the imagination, that our society really like depends upon imagination, and relationality, and will be a theme that we'll definitely come back to in this series, and in future series. It's an important part of my my thinking about esotericism and human nature, and imagination plays a big role in that. Talking not just about the individual imagination, but we can also talk about the kind of popular imagination, the way that culture imagines certain things, like for example, many aspects of, or many parts, especially in the recent past of Western culture, have often imagined esoteric practitioners or occultists as evil, like Satanists in league with dark forces. So we can talk about the popular imagination of the occult or of the esoteric, which has tremendous effects on on society and its development. Again, as I already mentioned, it's only with the rise of the mechanical philosophy and thinkers like Descartes and Mersenne and others of that school, where imagination takes on this essentially pejorative meaning of unreal. Let's see, imagination is obviously etymologically linked to the word image, and as we mentioned before, images, magical images are connected to talismans and are an extremely important part of the esoteric, Western esoteric tradition. And so the power and significance and even the kind of semi-autonomous agency exercised by images will certainly be something that we'll talk about throughout this series. Let's see, I think, again, a little bit like what I was saying about imagination involved in relationships and the popular imagination. I think it's also important that imagination is seen as a transpersonal domain, that not only does our imagination concern others and our relationship with others, but a lot of esoteric practitioners, as well as many artists and other creators, have come to feel that in imaginative action, we are able to make contact with things that are not just ourselves, that imagination is not simply a lone, isolated mind creating things, but imagination is actually a medium or a space, a kind of intermediate space between ourselves and either like a collective mind or a collective imagination, or even higher like angelic or divine worlds, and that imagination and imaginative action is a way of relating to these sort of transhuman or superhuman realms of experience. So in line with that, it's worth recognizing that the imagination or the imaginal world, the mundus imaginalis, from the scholar Henri Corbin, is, I think we can often think of it as more or less equivalent, maybe not necessarily synonymous, but at least very closely equivalent to a number of esoteric ideas like the astral plane, what in Hermetic Kabbalah is called the world of Yetzirah, or in more traditional esotericism is known as the spiritus mundi, which are often kind of intermediate planes that sit between like the material realm and the higher like divine or celestial realms. All right, so let's see. Here's a quote from the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, the CCRU, who are a group of sort of rogue academics from England, in the UK in the 1990s, who were really interested in cyber culture, a number of other themes, but a number of them were also sometimes semi-seriously or ambiguously seriously interested in aspects of esotericism and occultism. So anyways, here's a quote from an essay that they wrote, mainly concerning William Burroughs, who's someone we'll talk about in a future video for sure. Let's see, so they say, every act of writing is a sorcerous operation, a partisan action in a war where multitudes of factual events are guided by the powers of illusion. Even representational realism participates, albeit unknowingly, in magical war, collaborating with the dominant control system by implicitly endorsing its claim to be the only possible reality. Let's see, so they're talking about writing here, but I mean, I think this is essentially because they're focused on Burroughs here, but I think we can really extend this to any sort of creative action, not just writing, but yeah, any artistic or creative action can be thought of as a sorcerous operation. The question just becomes, what the intent and aim of that is, even, or perhaps even especially, when the person undertaking that action or that act of creation isn't necessarily thinking of it that way. Hermeticists, esoteric practitioners, I think still have a lot to gain by seeing people engaged in magical actions and ritual actions all the time, and then asking, what the intent and effect of those actions are. I was recently listening to an interview with the electronic musician Drew McDowell, who in that interview was talking about how he really sees all music as, I think the interviewer had asked him something about making ritual music or ritualized creation of music. But he was saying that he sees all music as ritual music. And then, again, just asking the question of what the effect of that is, which I thought was a really sort of interesting perspective, rather than separating out like, some music is ritual music, or, some artistic creation is a sorcerous operation. Again, we can seeing it all that way, and then asking, what the point of it is. Like, is the point of this to serve as a backdrop, for, in a shopping mall and getting people to consume more, or is the purpose to, to create a liberatory sort of transformation in consciousness? And that, we've already seen, I think, in that the editorial from Rapid Eye by Simon Dwyer there, we had the suggestion that occulture might be sort of apolitical, but I think this quote is not intended as a response to that, but a nice sort of rejoinder to that perspective that any creative act is a partisan action, that we cannot help but anytime we're creating any sort of image, we're always creating an image of the nature of reality, of human society, of human nature, and those things always have political and social implications, and we just need to be aware of that and act in accordance with that, rather than pretending that we can step outside of that domain. Let's see, second part of that sentence here, the multitudes of factual events guided by the powers of illusion. Again, as we've already said, this theme of the relationship between, between dream and reality, or imagination and reality, between fiction and reality, and exploring that weird and complex relationship. Let's see, so second sentence there saying even representational realism participates, in this magical war, that by reproducing, conventional images, it's a magical action that reinforces the illusion that there is no such thing as magic, that reality is simply what it is, and nothing else, and that, the sort of creative potentials and possibilities that magical practitioners might imagine are not real and are not available. We've already seen a number of examples of, especially some of the kind of comic books and things from sort of low culture, but also genre fiction, things from fantasy and horror or science fiction, which are often considered to be like lower or less worthy than truly high cultural productions of drama or historical epics or things like that. That is, I think, starting to change a bit in more recent times, though. I don't know, the recent spate of horrible comic book movies is maybe an evidence that it's not always for the best. But I think the dominance of those particular genres, again, could be thought of as a kind of sorcerer's operation, that sort of dramatic realism, in films or in novels or whatever else, is, again, these sort of repeated magical operations to reinforce a particular image of human nature, of human society, and of the nature of reality. But without knowing it, these creators are implicitly, are collaborating with the dominant control system. Obviously, there's very political language here of collaboration and partisanship here. All right, let's just keep moving on here. All right, so picking up on some of these same themes here, but maybe from a slightly different angle here. We have a quote from David Graeber, the anthropologist and sort of anarchist thinker, who very sadly died quite young, just a few years ago. This is a quote from his book, The Utopia of Rules. So he says, utopian socialists like Saint-Simon, so we're in the sort of early 19th century here, kind of post-French Revolution. Utopian socialists like Saint-Simon were arguing that artists needed to become the avant-garde, or vanguard, as he put it, of a new social order, providing the grand visions that industry now had the power to bring into being. What at the time might have seemed the fantasy of an eccentric pamphleteer soon became the charter for a sporadic, uncertain, but apparently permanent alliance that endures to this day. If artistic avant-gardes and social revolutionaries have felt a particular affinity for one another ever since, borrowing each other's languages and ideas, it appears to have been insofar as both have remained committed to the idea that the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently. In this sense, a phrase like all power to the imagination expresses the very quintessence of the left. That last phrase that he references there, all power to the imagination, that is a phrase, one of the most famous sort of phrases and slogans from the events of May 1968 in Paris, the various sort of strikes and like kind of student uprising and actions from that time. Let's see. I think this is again, I think taps into a lot of the things that we've already been talking about, the relationship between, imagination and social transformation and revolution, and the relationship between avant-garde art and like leftist politics, I think here is really important. I suppose maybe the one thing that makes me slightly uneasy in this quotation is he says that, although I completely agree that the hidden truth of the world, it is something that we make, that is something that is produced and reproduced. Again, sort of tapping back into that idea of the sorcerous operations, that these are something that are that need to be produced and maintained. They're not simply like objective givens. But he says, and could just as easily make differently. I think that perhaps it's worth thinking about, to put it in esoteric terms, to think of these of social, transformation, or even the transformation of the individual self and the individual life as something more like alchemical actions, that we have to start with what is actually in front of us or what is given, and that those things can then be transformed. That part of the power of the imagination is not that the world can just be instantly like recreated into something completely new with no relationship to what was there before, but rather that the imagination has the potential to see unrealized possibilities within the world. Let's see, so sticking with David Graeber here, and actually from the same book, The Utopia of Rules, he makes this distinction between what he calls an ontology of violence versus an ontology of the imagination. Graeber himself, of course, is not an esotericist and doesn't use it. And he's sort of specifically talking about a kind of political ontology. But I think we can extend it sort of beyond his own usage and use them in a more broader ontological or metaphysical sort of sense. So an ontology of violence is ontology is a sort of philosophical term talking about the kind of theory of the nature, the ultimate nature of reality. So an ontology of violence is a view of reality that really that foregrounds sort of violent action. Not always things that we might explicitly think of violence, but often the idea that that reality is simply out there, that it is inflexible, and that we are confronted by it, and our choice is essentially either to suffer or to submit to its concerns. And so this can happen at the most sort of abstract or high level, where this could be a way of thinking about the nature of like the physical universe, that it simply is what it is, and we just have to accept that. I think this is often seen at the level of biology and some of the misuses of like evolutionary theory, for example. Like in social Darwinism, for example, there's an argument that, particular systems, in particular kind of like brutal sort of free market capitalism and competition, I meant to say, free capitalism and competition are simply in line with the biological nature of humans and the laws of evolution, and that any attempt to create a system that would be more equitable, more just, that wouldn't have class oppression, and it can only make things worse and can only harm, and that we need to just sort of submit to that hard biological evolutionary reality. which of course is a total misuse of evolutionary theory. Other examples of ontology of violence would be things like, again, we already mentioned free market capitalism, but, the idea that is simply the only way that things can be, that there are no other possibilities. There is no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher famously said, and that we simply have to accommodate ourselves to those things, even if we don't like them. And there's not really any possibility of transforming or reimagining them. But ultimately, the view of reality is focused on submitting to things that have the capacity to harm us, which could even include things like the police or the military. So obviously, this is associated very strongly by Graeber with the political right wing, and I think, from myself anyways, I think that's been a really important way of thinking about the nature, of the political right, is this ontology of violence, which shows up even in people who may think of themselves as liberals or as centrists. That looking for that attitude, I think is always I've found it to be a really helpful way for thinking through political situations. But the alternative here, the ontology of the imagination, which Graeber is obviously associating with the left, as we saw in that previous quote, sees reality as something that again is created and recreated, and also something that contains all sorts of possibilities. That no thing is ever just a kind of brute given that we have to simply accept for being what it is, but that things are always produced in relationship with other things, that things are always in the process of transformation, and that things, both objects, people, sort of social forms, social dynamics, culture, that all of these things contain unrealized potential, and that there's always that possibility of transformation hidden within things, and that ontologies of violence always act to conceal those potentials and to make it look like transformation is simply impossible, or is only harmful. Rather than the ontology of the imagination that sees that humans have this constant creative capacity to imagine new forms of life, new forms of relating to each other, new forms of being in the world, and I think that ontology of the imagination is actually extremely compatible with esoteric sort of practice and hermetic and esoteric philosophy. And also I think we can see in a lot of cultural artifacts, cultural products, that same sort of like possibility for imagining other realities. And I think that, as I was saying at the very beginning of this video, people encountering esoteric ideas, especially through, through music or art or literature, I think get some kind of taste of what I'm calling here that ontology of the imagination, that there are possibilities, that things can be transformed, that we're not simply born into a world and have to, that it is completely formed and determined ahead of us, and we simply have to accommodate ourselves to something that it is simply given to us. So yeah, I think that's a helpful way of thinking about the some of the power of cultural things, is that they really awaken that sense of an ontology of the imagination in those who encounter and consume those forms. Oops. Here we go. Okay, this is a quote here from Alan Moore, who we mentioned previously as the author of Promethea, and we'll talk about again in a whole video. And I think just 2 weeks from now, we'll do a video on Alan Moore's Promethea. Moore is a practicing ceremonial magician himself. A number of his works concern ceremonial magic, and Moore is also an anarchist. So he's not just a magician, but also a real committed kind of radical leftist here. So this is an interview with him, interview conducted by Margaret Killjoy from a book that she did called Mythmakers and Lawbreakers, Anarchist Writers on Fiction, which is a series of interviews with anarchist writers. There's a really interesting one in there with Ursula Le Guin, really great writer and also an anarchist. Anyways, so in this interview with Moore, Moore says, "With relation to the magic, I can remember one of the last conversations I had with my very dear and much missed friend, the writer Kathy Acker. This was very soon after I had just become interested and involved with magic. I was saying to her how the way I was then seeing things was that basically magic was about the last and best bastion of revolution. The political revolution, the sexual revolution, these things that had their part and had their limits, whereas the idea of a magical revolution would revolve around actually changing people's consciousnesses, which is to say, actually changing the nature of perceived reality. Kathy agreed with that completely. It sort of followed on some of her own experiences, and I still think that that is true. In some ways, magic is the most political of all the areas I'm involved with. So again, reiterating some of the same themes and ideas from a slightly different perspective here that we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes or so here. I think my inner Marxist, I suppose, like maybe a little bit like with the Graeber quote, slightly bristles at this idea that the important political thing is to change people's minds. I think that can all too easily sort of fall into this sort of liberal kind of ideology that, things like, whatever, like, racism or different forms of violence and oppression are always the product of ignorance, and that we just simply need, like education, that people need to just be shown, that their views are incorrect, and then they will therefore change their views, that it's just getting people to change the way that they see the world and see each other, and that's all that's really necessary for political transformation, which in a way is really kind of denying political action and denying the necessity of transforming like economic relationships or relationships of production. But I think, in more, he's not disowning, the political, he's not trying to be apolitical here, but rather, directly connecting the transformation of consciousness with the political, which, is a constant theme within the radical left. I mean, even in sort of orthodox like Marxism, the idea of the development of class consciousness, of getting, the proletariat to consciously recognize itself with the proletariat, casting off, letting things like nationality or race or religion or whatever else being the center point for like the foundation of an identity, or the basis for various forms of allegiance, but the development of the consciousness that the workers of the world are all fundamentally share the same sort of values or goals, or would benefit from the same sort of actions is an incredibly important part of their like theory of revolution. Or if we think about, say, like kind of feminist, like consciousness raising groups from, like from the 1970s, where the aim there was to help women become, like consciously aware of the extent to which things like, patriarchy and patriarchal systems affected their personal lives. That again is a sort of transformation of consciousness. A slogan often associated with that time, which nowadays I feel like is often quite misused, but the slogan, that the personal is political, I think is a great way of thinking about that sort of transformation of consciousness, that instead of seeing, whatever, the way that your, parents favored your brother, or, the way that your sort of husband treats you, or the way that men in the world like treat you, isn't just a kind of personal issue either with yourself or with those individuals, but is part of a broader, patriarchal system. Rather than, I feel like today people often use that quote almost in the reverse, that where larger social issues are sort of reduced down to the personal level and the way that it affects people personally, which is a very like individualistic, I feel like kind of distortion of that, rather than, the push towards a collectivism. But yeah, just coming back to the quote here, because we are going on a bit long here, but I think connecting those sorts of political consciousness and the transformation of political consciousness to the practice of magic, I think is a really suggestive and powerful idea, and something we will definitely continue to talk about and reflect on throughout this series. All right, so I had originally had some more slides here about some other sort of political and social kind of dimensions and implications of a culture, but just for the sake of time, I sort of truncated that, and we'll just mention a couple of things here. So something that I'd like to return to, and something, well, the first point here I hope is already kind of obvious from what's being said, but that, the cultural world or culture or the esoteric domain is not something that is simply like radical or reactionary, is not something that is sort of belongs to the left, or to the right, and that I think sometimes I've seen like leftists and radicals wanting to, sort of reject sort of esotericism. I mean, there's a variety of reasons that they might do that, but one of them can be the perception that that this zone is reactionary in some way, and the presence of reactionaries, even like sort of neo-Nazis and fascists and things like that within esotericism. That I mean, if you spend any time sort of in sort of esoteric communities and things like that online, it's kind of unavoidable that you encounter these people. But sort of drawing some inspiration from the British poet Sean Bonney, who I originally was going to talk about in more detail, but his thinking is just a little too complex and would take a little too much time for this video here. I think it's important to see these things as a place of struggle, and not to simply, even the presence of really like pernicious sort of far right ideologies within this zone of culture is not a reason to abandon it, but rather a reason to continue to engage in it, but just doing it with a kind of political social consciousness, and seeing that as an important zone of struggle, that there's a power and a potentiality here, and if we simply abandon that space and that potentiality over to the right, we're essentially handing weapons to the enemy. That there is really something to be gained here, and that it's worth sort of committing to and struggling with, and that's, I think, an important part of my own sort of project here, and my own belief that Hermeticism and esoteric practice and that worldview associated with that have I think a tremendous amount to offer people in the contemporary world, and could be not sufficient on its own, but could certainly contribute towards the types of transformation that our world is so badly in need of. And that's something we can definitely come back to in future videos, and really in every video I'll ever do on this channel. Also, something we'll talk about throughout this series is what I'm calling asynchronous temporality. Again, drawing this from Sean Bonney, and who in turn is drawing it from the writer Ernst Bloch. But seeing, within the present, the continued presence of the past, and that we are never simply in a given moment, but there's always kind of multiple time streams or elements of things that are out of time still within the present. And that these sort of contradictions, like between the past and the future, between the modern and the traditional, I think the conflict between like magic and science, or sometimes religion and science, can often be a kind of a face or an appearance of what is in a way really a kind of like temporal contradiction, that the traditional remains sort of present within the modern, and they have this kind of like conflicted relationship with each other. Again, enchantment and disenchantment, that's a way that a lot of people have talked about the transition to modernity, the move from an enchanted world to a disenchanted world. But in that contradiction, there is both is potential and power, but also danger. I think one of the key ways that like right-wing movements and ideologies often function is by taking a contradiction and trying to sort of discharge that contradiction into an externalized opposition. And so I think you see this especially in like reactionary and fascist movements, the attempt to go back into the past to recover not just a past that was better than the present, but also to recover at least the imagination, or what is imagined as a time where time was synchronous and non-contradictory. again, this is a sort of really big topic that we will definitely come back to in some future videos, especially with, I think there's some really interesting examples of a cultural art and production that are really helpful for thinking through some of these issues. And the opposition, that I've already mentioned here between radical and reactionary, I think is a kind of almost like a meta sort of opposition, which is an opposition that, or a contradiction that relates to these sort of temporal contradictions like past and future, whereas I think the radical perspective is to embrace that contradiction. The reactionary orientation is always to try to split the contradiction into an opposition, and then to sort of align oneself with one pole over the other, and then often to destroy the competing pole, which is a way of thinking that you see all throughout like reactionary politics and movements, especially today. I mean, these are not just historical things, but obviously like real threats throughout the world today. And I think the development of the magical consciousness can certainly help us understand these things in a deeper way and learn to engage with them in a more to perceive them in a more accurate way, and to engage with them in a more efficacious way. All right, and then finally, again related to this idea of contradiction, drawing on the surrealists, who we will talk about at great length throughout this series and in future series as well, who are extremely important to my thinking about modern Hermeticism and esotericism. But this concept of the marvelous, which in one of Louis Aragon's novels, he talks about as the appearance of the marvelous as the appearance of contradiction within the world. So again, connecting contradiction and the embrace of contradiction to sort of revolutionary, transformative, social transformative processes, but also seeing these things as really rooted in the nature of reality, and seeing contradiction also as the part of what magic is, and how it appears, and yeah, that's something we'll definitely come back to in future videos. All right, just in the last couple minutes here, that essentially concludes our video for the day, or for this week, but I just wanted to mention a few of the topics that we will cover throughout the rest of this series. So this is definitely not complete. I'm sure other things will sort of occur to me as we go along here. But I just wanted to mention a few of the sort of social and cultural movements and streams that we will reference or touch on, just to give you a little bit of a better sense of sort of where I'm coming from, and some of the kind of field that we'll sort of be moving through. So I've already mentioned a number of these things already, but surrealism will be extremely important for us. Again, we'll be talking about modern and avant-garde literature and culture, radical politics. We'll also talk about things like ecology, feminism, queer culture, the counterculture of the 60s and 70s that we've already mentioned here, psychedelia, psychedelic culture, psychedelic experience will all be things that we'll come back to throughout this series. Afrofuturism as well, which I think Afrofuturism in particular is a really powerful way of thinking about some of those sort of temporal contradictions between past, present, and future. Let's see, we've already mentioned industrial music and culture, talking about Thelema, chaos magic, the Golden Dawn, some of these really important modern esoteric movements. Also neo-paganism, Wicca, the goddess movement, which are, I think, much closer to things like Thelema and chaos magic than a lot of people involved with those movements sometimes realize or understand, but that's something we'll definitely touch on. We'll also talk a little bit about psychogeography, and I also want to touch on things like media studies, like cyberculture, technology, and that relationship with sort of esoteric worldviews and magic, and what the two have to offer each other. And then again, talking about thinking about these sort of weird contradictory temporalities, we'll talk a little bit about the concept of hauntology and its as a cultural or artistic movement. All right, just a few of the kind of authors and sort of works that we'll be talking about. Again, definitely not complete, and it's possible that some of these things may be changed or rearranged as we go through it, as I actually work on the material. Talking about the music of industrial groups like Throbbing Gristle, Coil, talking about Sun Ra, composers like Alexander Scriabin and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen or Giacinto Scelsi. bands like The Fall or the Third Ear Band, also Alice Coltrane. In the realm of visual art, we'll talk about Austin Osman Spare, a number of the surrealists, including Max Ernst, Leonora Carrington, Kurt Seligman, Victor Brauner, Antonin Artaud, and probably others as well. Also Brian Geisen. And then we'll definitely do a video talking about some like contemporary artists who engage with esoteric themes. I haven't settled exactly on who will be included in that video and who will not. But I don't know, just kind of off the top of my head, I was thinking about Ty Shani, Ian Johnstone, Jesse Bransford, and Mary McGregor Reed, possibly some others. We'll see how that goes. All right, for films, some of the films that we'll mention include Kenneth Anger's, a variety of Kenneth Anger's films, particularly from the Magic Lantern cycle. We'll talk about some of Derek Jarman's films and his connection to some other esoterically sort of minded figures and into industrial music. As you mentioned, we'll talk about the 1920 silent film The Golem, as well as a 1967 film of the same title. We'll talk about a film called Penda's Fen, the Sun Ra movie, Space is the Place. We'll talk about folk horror, in particular like folk horror cinema, which again will offer a nice a way of thinking about the kind of conflict between the past and the future, between the traditional and the modern. And in particular, when we talk about folk horror, I'll talk about some of Ben Wheatley's films, like A Field in England or In the Earth, or there's a couple others as well. All right, in prose, mainly novels here, but some kind of short fiction and as well. We'll talk about Leonora Carrington's novel, The Hearing Trumpet, the novel The Golem by Gustav Meyrink, Ishmael Reed's novel, Mumbo Jumbo. In connection with The Golem, we'll talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which also has some other interesting esoteric and occult themes throughout it, and also really thematizes that sort of conflict between the traditional and the modern, between esotericism and science, I think in a really interesting way. As mentioned before, we'll talk about William Burroughs and Brian Geisen. We'll talk about China Miéville's novel, Last Days of New Paris, which is a novel, a kind of interesting sort of fictionalized magical account of surrealists and their relationship to the resistance movement in France during World War II. Let's see, we'll talk about H.P. Lovecraft and weird fiction, probably a number of other weird fiction authors as well will be mentioned, like Arthur Machen or Algernon Blackwood. Might have some time to talk about Alan Garner. We'll see about that one. A few poets that we'll talk about include Philip Lamantia, Diane de Prima, Aimé Césaire, Garrett Lansing, Will Alexander, Ishmael Reed. Several of those are surrealists. So yeah, definitely talking about those in connection with surrealism and some on their own. Let's see, we already mentioned we're talking about The Invisibles and Promethea with comics. When we talk about H.P. Lovecraft and weird fiction, we might also mention Alan Moore's comic Providence. In the world of nonfiction, we'll talk about a book I've already mentioned a couple times here, The Morning of the Magicians by Pauwels and Berger. Again, really, really influential, though often today not very well known piece of 1960s occulture. We'll talk about Andy Sharp's book, English Heretic, and his musical project by that name. We'll talk about the writings of Peter Lamborn Wilson, also known as Hakim Bey. Let's see, Carolyn Merchant's book, The Death of Nature, and Celia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, which we'll talk about in relationship to feminism and ecology, and some other topics we've already mentioned. Let's see, others include Ronald Hutton. In combination with psychedelia and psychedelic culture, we'll talk about Terence McKenna and Dale Pendle and Eric Davis. So let's see, that's the last slide. So this concludes our video. Let's see, I managed to keep it under 2 hours. It's pretty good for me. All right, so thanks for watching. I hope that was interesting and has given you, some appetite for the videos that will follow. If you please feel free to, if you have any suggestions, comments, ideas, whatever else, you can drop them in the comments. You can also find my link to my email address in the comments below. Again, all these videos are offered with no paywall. They're freely available to everyone. But if people would like to support the work, I would really appreciate it, and it would definitely make it possible to continue doing this and even to produce more. So you can buy a copy of my book. You can sign up on my Patreon. There's no real subscriber benefits to signing up for that. Again, I'm trying to work on a sort of gift economy model here of simply offering these things and then inviting you to just think about what this is worth to you, and inviting you to consider contributing to this project. Let's see. So, like I said, we'll be I'll doing these videos at least approximately weekly over the next. This series will last over the next 6 months. So look for the next video in this series within the next week, which will be about the musical group Coil. So thanks everybody. Thanks for watching, and please also if you like it, of course you can do the things that are good for the algorithm, liking and subscribing. I definitely also appreciate people sharing these videos if you find them interesting, whether on social media or Discord channels, or just letting people that you think might be interested. Share it. I think spreading these things by word of mouth is a great way to help new people discover this material. So I'd really appreciate that as well. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye.